Alright, Happy New Year, everyone. I know it's been about a week and a half since I last posted a video. And yes, my year-end list for 2024 are still not out yet. I'm hoping to get them done fairly soon, hopefully by the end of the month. But yeah, it's going to be later than I was hoping. I guess the thing is, I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with that. Do I want to prioritize quality or do I want to prioritize getting them out on time? And I think I'm going to fall somewhere in between there, probably more leaning toward getting them out on time because they're not going to be super high quality. I know that right now. Neither are the reviews that I'm doing in this video. These are kind of rushed. Again, I'm just starting college, I'm working a job, and I have a life outside of just YouTube videos, so I don't have all the time in the world to just spend on this, putting in lots of effort to these reviews. But yeah, so these are kind of rushed, not the best reviews. I didn't listen to the albums that I'm talking about here a whole lot. Just take everything I say with a grain of salt. As always, it's just me sharing how I personally feel about the albums. I'm not trying to tell you objectively what the albums are about or what they represent or how good or bad they are objectively. Of course, I cannot do that. But yeah, let's get right into the reviews. Starting with, here's a 40-minute black metal album by a solo project of Josiah Wilkinson, who I'd never heard of until this came out at the very start of 2025. Now, unfortunately, I don't entirely love this, but it does still have its moments, like the elegance of the plucking strings on Full of Blood Sealed Well, and the ferocious vocals on the closing track are quite impressive. I do think the opening track is a little bit boring. It's much mellower than a lot of this record is, and while that's not necessarily a bad thing, I don't think it builds tension super well. And sometimes the production can feel a little choppy, most notably on the second track. But still, I do like a lot of the melodies, and it's mostly got a feeling of intensity that shines through, but the bigger problem is I just don't think I'm going to remember this album or feel a whole lot like returning to it. And it'll probably wind up not having much of an impact on me in the long run, just like probably the vast majority of albums that I review. Look, I don't hate this album. And even though I think I'm probably missing something in the story arc throughout the album, it does seem kind of interesting. It seems to depict some kind of war and somebody struggling to figure out their own religion, made more difficult by the surrounding circumstances. And I especially like It Kindly Bent, which I may be completely misunderstanding, but the way I read it is really striking, potentially portraying God as more of an anti-hero, who may be mostly well-intended, but also has some serious issues, and it's a very unique idea. I don't always love the electronic elements, and again, there are some production issues in my opinion, and I don't think I'm going to be going back to this much, but hey, it's pretty solid for what it is. I'll give it a 6.5, I mostly enjoyed it. So I'm not entirely sure how Richard Sallis started getting some buzz from the critics, although I think he originally got a small following on YouTube from making remixes. But anyway, he's got a new album out that has been getting at least a little bit of buzz in the critic world, and I've been going back and forth on it with each listen. But I haven't really loved this on any of my listens through the album, and as of right now, I'm really not feeling it at all. Yeah, I sort of get the appeal, and the writing clearly had a lot of effort put into it, with a story that kind of feels like someone having an existential crisis, including having a hard time accepting the quick passage of time. But to me, a lot of it just feels like I've heard it before and done better. But with that being said, I did find it quite haunting in the penultimate track when he says, "If this was the end of the world, would you believe it? Could you honestly say we don't deserve it?" Wow, what a line. But I can't say I really love the vocals, and the compositions aren't grabbing my attention much either, as a lot of it just sounds like stuff that I've heard before but done better. And some of the higher frequencies here can get really annoying at certain points, especially the parts that connect the songs together. But with all that being said, this album is probably better than I'm giving it credit for. It's just not really my cup of tea, but there was clearly a lot of effort put into it, and while I think the mixing is kind of rough and I'm not super wowed by the writing, I still think it's worth a shot. For me, it's a strong 5 out of 10, but it probably deserves a higher rating. I reviewed Stations by Feller's Island last year on my blog, and so far that's been my only experience listening to this Canadian ambient artist. And I don't remember really loving that album, and considering my busy schedule with work and school and also trying to finish up my year-end list for 2024, I decided not to revisit that album first and just go right into this one. And I find it interesting how the vocals basically just sound like instruments, and thus I'm not really sure if it makes it easier or harder for me to take lyrics into account when discussing my opinions on this album. But with that being said, I do think it's kind of fitting for the opening track considering how much it seems to be about just living and not worrying about overthinking everything. And hey, this song sounds really good too. But like the vast majority of ambient music that I listen to, I highly doubt I'm going to remember this. I mean, that can even be said about a lot of ambient music that I really like, and yet here I'm just kind of bored by this album. Yeah, I do like some of the vibes this is aiming for, but the production just sounds a little rougher than I'd like it to, and the percussion isn't always super well mixed if you ask me. That being said, I do really like a lot of the small details on Where Will We Be, and the vast majority of this album is fairly pleasant while it's on. But it does overstay its welcome for me, and that's not a good sign considering it's under 40 minutes. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10. There is an audience for this, but it's not me. This was the first album of 2025 that I listened to, and I'll admit it's a pretty cool experiment. I mean, am I going to be going back to this much? Probably not, but I can still appreciate the soundscape that it is. It feels sort of like the kind of thing you'd expect to hear in some kind of museum where you look at a bunch of abstract art. There's probably a word for that I'm trying to describe, but I don't know what it is. But yeah, I found this kind of intriguing, and I certainly think the sound quality is pretty strong. Now look, as much as I have warmed up to instrumental ambient music a lot more in recent years, this does still feel like a tough album to revisit. Actually, scratch that. Not a tough one to revisit, just one that really doesn't feel worth going back to a whole lot for me. It's more one that I can appreciate and admire more than I actually love it. And I think it has a lot to do with the same reasons why I end up forgetting so many other ambient albums. It just doesn't really have a lot of catchy moments or an impactful enough mood or vibe that it really stands out to me. But still, I did enjoy this album. I'll give it a 7 out of 10, and I'm definitely curious to hear more from this duo. Alright, so this is technically not a studio album, but I'm realizing more and more as the years go by that I don't really need to stick to my only reviewing studio albums rule, partially because I think it's kind of a stupid rule in the first place, but also because there are albums like this that feel like a studio album, even though it's really just a bunch of outtakes by Mark William Lewis. And by the way, there's another review coming up that I'm going to be doing soon, which really made me rethink that rule. But anyway, I'd never heard of Mark William Lewis until this came out. I was just looking for new music to listen to, and with the help of my mum, I found this new collection of tracks and thought to myself, hey, I might as well review it. And it makes for a fairly easy review for me, because this album just doesn't really give me much to say. And it's partially because I don't have the lyrics in front of me, and while I can hear what some of them are, there's always the chance of me hearing it wrong, and it just becomes harder to piece together what I think the lyrics could be about when I don't have them right in front of me. And also, I wasn't always paying attention to the words being sung, I'll fully admit that. Anyway, my dad said this sounds like a cross between Leonard Cohen and cruise ship music, and I can sort of see where he's coming from. I personally listened to a lot of Leonard Cohen as a kid, and I can hear the similarities in the vocals. I also hear a little bit of Grian Chatten from Fontaine's DC. And while I think this is quite well produced, I don't find the songs particularly memorable or interesting. And yeah, part of that might just be me not listening to this enough, but I also don't find it all that surprising that these are outtakes because you can really hear it. And again, the production actually sounds pretty good, but it does feel like a collection of really well-produced recordings from a jam session without a lot of writing that went into it. Maybe that's unfair, although I wouldn't be totally shocked if that's what this is. But look, I'd rather not spend more time on this than I already have. It's not bad, and I actually somewhat enjoy it as background music, and I can sort of see the appeal of it, how it might click more for the right audience. But it's just not for me, so I'll give this a strong 6 out of 10. I'd never heard of Edward Skeletrix until now, but this was the first album of 2025 that I saw getting a fairly large amount of attention, and the reviews I saw were quite mixed. And after listening to it a few times, I can see why. This is definitely an album that falls under the category of experimental hip-hop, where it could be viewed as a scattered mess with no real artistic value, or a genre-blending magnum opus that breaks the boundaries of what hip-hop can be. And I see the argument for both, but I fall somewhere in between, as I don't hate this as much as some people do, but I also had a really hard time fully getting into it. Don't get me wrong, this is creative, I'll give it that much, but the songs do feel a little thrown together at points, and the lyrics are very hit or miss. I do sort of feel like I may be missing some sort of greater concept, but it also feels more like a collage than a fully cohesive album. And unfortunately here, I think that's to the album's detriment, especially when there aren't really a lot of really catchy moments. Instead, we get the bad Playboy Cardi impression of Blurry Picture, and the weird auto-tune that makes Life So Funny sound like a bad Halsey song. I do find some of these moments slightly compelling when they're on, such as the synth work of Plastic Body, even though the bass gets really annoyingly boosted on that track. And also the noteworthy vocal delivery on Typical Rap Song 12, as well as an admittedly really good instrumental of Typical Rap Song 11. And while drug dealer Injects his Fentanyl does have a fairly annoying vocal performance, it also has some of the best lyrics on the album, which are seemingly about trauma and using wealth to try and deal with it. But I'm not confident I'm going to remember this album. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. It is worth saying that if you want a very unique hip-hop album to listen to, you should probably give this a shot, but it's not for me at all. Gumshoes is the solo project of Sam Sparks, a singer-songwriter who has a tradition at this point of releasing an album at the start of each year, which he has now done 3 years in a row and plans to for 2026 as well, and probably continuing into the future, I'd assume. Anyway, each track here follows a story from the perspective of a different insect. And while I will say there are some cool ideas here, in fact, the concept as a whole is an interesting idea, and I like some of the details within some of these tracks, such as Bad Omens, in which the narrator talks about bad omens and potentially being one. And Playing Pretend really tries to let the listener hear the harsh reality of what being an insect might be like, and it also has some of the best melodies on this record. The problem, in my opinion, is that the melodies aren't very strong for the most part on most of this album, and sometimes this just feels a little too reminiscent of AJR, mostly in the vocals. And I say that as someone who's always been able to tolerate AJR's music more than most, but it's still a weird similarity I noticed. Don't get me wrong, Sam isn't a bad singer, nor is Jack Met in my opinion, but I just don't really love the vocals in this style of music, which also sounds sort of AJR-esque at points. Well look, I don't hate this album or anything, not even close, and the instrumentation does sound nice for the most part, even though I wish the production sounded a little tighter. It's just not really my cup of tea. I probably won't feel any desire to go back to this, even if it is at least memorable. So for me it's a 6 out of 10. I mean, I'd recommend it though, it's an interesting album, I think it's pretty good. Here's an almost entirely instrumental ambient album by a very obscure artist who I never heard of until this album came out. I was just looking for ambient albums to review to start the year and came across this. And I mostly like it, but I also just didn't find it all that captivating or unique. Like a lot of instrumental ambient albums, it doesn't really give me a whole lot to say. I mean, I could try to go into all the details of different imagery that it brings to my mind or how it makes me feel, but here I didn't really experience much of that. And I'm not even saying this is a bad album, just that aside from having mostly nice synth timbres and a good sense of dynamics and some nice build-ups, there's just not really much worth talking about here in my opinion. So I'll give it a 6 out of 10. I doubt I'm going to remember this in a few months' time, but for now I can praise it for being some pretty good ambient music. I think I've just got to accept at this point that I'm probably never going to like another Asian Glow album as much as 2022's Stalled Flutes means. And yeah, part of that is pretty easy to understand, considering how incredible that album is. But I also haven't really loved any other Asian Glow album, and unfortunately that continues to be the case with this new one. Now look, for me Asian Glow's music has never really been about the lyrics. That's not to say they aren't a crucial part of it, but it's not the reason that I like this artist. And yeah, here that's partially because this is mostly in Korean, and I only know English, which obviously isn't anything against the album itself, and is really just a me thing. But look, I like some of the vibes that this is going for musically. I just wish the vocals weren't so buried, and I wish the choruses stood out a little more. Yeah, there are some nice musical moments, but then you also get stuff like the chopped up vocals on Camel 8 Strike, which otherwise would have been one of the best songs on the album, and instead it's just kind of ruined. I don't know, maybe I just needed to give this more listens, but after 3 listens all the way through, I can't say I'm all that wowed. I do like the eerie choppiness of the closing track, and the melodies are mostly good on this album, but I still can't go higher than a 6 out of 10. Alright, so I'm gonna keep this one brief, like most of these reviews, that's just what I wrote in the script. Partially because of my busy schedule and also trying to finish up my year-end lists, but also because I'm really bad at reviewing albums that aren't in English. This is in randomized order. I didn't know what order these reviews were going to be in. I just talked about another album that's not in English. But anyway, I know I always say to take my lyrical interpretations with a grain of salt because I'm bad at analyzing lyrics anyway, but that's especially the case when the lyrics are in a language that I don't know. But another reason I'm keeping this brief is because I really didn't like this album all that much. A lot of the melodies feel forgettable, and while there is a nice mix between mellow tracks and bangers, a lot of the individual songs just feel really generic. And it's also over an hour, which I just find to be too much for this album. Now, with this being said, there are some redeeming moments. I like the hard-hitting percussion of the opening track, which pairs well with Bad Bunny's energetic vocal performance and the bass that sounds really good in the mix. And I like the synths on Perfumito Nuevo. My apologies for these pronunciations, they're probably really bad. That song also has a really good feature from Reyneo, I hope I pronounced that correctly. And El Club has a darker sound to it that fits with the lyrics, and the production sounds mostly good. I also think the mellow acoustic vibe of Turista works pretty well, and I like that bass line on Lo Que Le Peso a Hawaii. Again, my apologies for the horrible pronunciations. Now, when it comes to the lyrics, well, Bad Bunny is horny as usual on this album, but whenever I look at the translations of his lyrics, I can't tell if they're really unique or if it's just not translating properly. And also, if they are translating properly, I can't tell if it's really corny or really creative. Maybe both. But anyway, I just didn't really like this album much. Yeah, I might be missing something, but I don't think I'm going to return to this anytime soon. Light 6 out of 10. So here's another album that's kind of tricky for me to review as well as I'd like to because it's not in English, and I couldn't even find the lyrics online to translate them in this case. But I still wanted to give this a few listens, and, well, I'm not really sure it's for me. Yeah, I like some of the melodies and the instrumentation, and I think the mixing is pretty good, but the vocals don't really work for me, and I think that's the biggest thing holding this record back from me. They often sound kind of off-pitch, and while I think it was an artistic choice, I don't really like how it sounds with this sort of smooth, chill, laid-back sound. Or maybe I shouldn't really use the word smooth, because some of the higher frequencies here sound really rough. It's also worth mentioning that this is almost an hour long, and there's just not enough here that stands out to me to justify its running time, at least to me. Yeah, like with pretty much every album in this video, I know I could have given it more time, and I might appreciate it more, but for now I'm thinking of 5.5 on this one. Just not really for me. Alright, finishing off these reviews, we got this new Lil Baby album. It's the first Lil Baby album that I've listened to, and based on the small amount of songs of his that I've heard, well, I have very mixed opinions. A lot of them were very forgettable, but music critics started taking him seriously when he released The Bigger Picture, which proves he could make a great song. But I was surprised by how negative a reception this album was getting compared to his other albums, and after listening to it, I don't fully understand why. I mean, look, I've never fully understood trap as a genre. That's not to say I don't like it, just that I'm not well equipped to discuss it. And that's especially true here because, like the rest of these reviews in this post, this review is very rushed and I didn't analyze it super closely. But with that being said, while a lot of the lyrics are kind of generic, Lil Baby raps some thoughtful lines here and there, and for the most part it's not like it's embarrassing or anything. Although if I'm missing something that's causing the critics to really dislike this, please let me know. I'm curious to know what it is about this that's giving it so many negative reviews. Yes, Redbone is a really bad song, with that disgusting oily synth that pierces through the entire song, but there are some moments that I really like, such as Free Promo, which pairs the synths and percussion really well together. I also like the chorus of By Myself and the Travis Scott feature on Stuff, and I mostly like Lil Baby's flows on this album. Oh, and there's also Dumb, Dumb, and Dumber, which is probably my favorite song here. It's got some super eerie synths, and all three rappers have really good flows that pair well with the instrumental. So overall, I actually mostly like this. I don't love it, which is why I'm giving it a 6 out of 10, but I thought it was decent. Again, maybe I'm completely wrong, but if I had to choose whether or not I'd recommend it, well, if you like trap music, you might like it. Again, I mostly did. Alright, thanks for watching. Again, I know these were kind of rushed. A big part of it is that I want to save some time to work on finishing up my 2024 year-end list. Hopefully by then I'll maybe be putting in a little bit more effort toward my 2025 videos. I'm going to try to actually put a bit more effort into this YouTube channel this year than I did last year. Last year, for the most part, I was just writing on my blog. I didn't have a YouTube channel until a few months ago, but I don't know. I want to try to maybe, give a little more detail in my reviews, but we'll see what happens. For now, I want to finish putting out my 2024 year-end lists, and I've got a few more reviews coming up that I know about. There's one individual album review that I'm going to plan to have posted fairly soon, but I think with all that being said, thank you for watching. I will see you again soon.